The story of animal life on Earth begins in water, in the quiet depths of ancient oceans that covered most of our planet more than 600 million years ago. The world was different then, almost unrecognizable, with continents arranged in unfamiliar patterns and an atmosphere that would seem strange to us today. Yet, in those ancient seas, something profound was beginning to happen, something that would eventually lead to all the animals we know, including ourselves. Before animals existed, life had already been present on Earth for billions of years. Simple organisms, single cells floating in the water, had been the only inhabitants of our planet for an extraordinarily long time. These microscopic beings reproduced by dividing, creating copies of themselves, and they drifted through the oceans in vast numbers, like too small to see without instruments we would not possess for billions of years. They were alive, certainly, but they were not animals. They lacked the complexity, the organization, the particular characteristics that would define animal life. The transition from single-celled organisms to multicellular life represents one of the most significant changes in the history of life on Earth. This change did not happen quickly. It unfolded over millions upon millions of years through countless generations of organisms that gradually developed the ability to remain together after cell division, to cooperate, to form structures more complex than any single cell could create alone. The earliest multicellular organisms were simple colonies of similar cells, but each cell still largely independent, but beginning to benefit from being part of a larger whole. Around 650 million years ago, perhaps somewhat earlier, the first organisms that we might recognize as animals began to appear in the fossil record. These earliest animals were soft-bodied creatures, lacking shells or bones, or any hard parts that might easily preserve as fossils. This makes them difficult to study, as soft tissues rarely fossilize well, leaving us with incomplete glimpses of these ancient forms of life. What we do know suggests they were relatively simple, perhaps similar in some ways to modern sponges, or to the microscopic larval stages of more complex animals. Sponges represent one of the most ancient lineages of animals still living today. They are simple in structure, lacking true tissues and organs, lacking nervous systems or digestive systems as we would recognize them. A sponge is essentially a collection of cells organized into a particular form, with channels and chambers that allow water to flow through its body. The cells of a sponge work together in a coordinated way, with different cells performing different functions, but each cell retains considerable independence. The sponge filters water constantly, extracting tiny particles of food, absorbing oxygen, and releasing waste products back into the surrounding ocean. This simple body plan, this method of living by filtering water, proved remarkably successful. Sponges have survived for more than 600 million years through countless environmental changes, mass extinctions, and the rise and fall of many other groups of animals. They persist today in oceans all around the world, from shallow coastal waters to the deepest ocean trenches, their basic body plan largely unchanged across hundreds of millions of years of Earth history. While sponges represent one ancient lineage of animal life, other early animals were developing different body plans, different ways of organizing cells into functional structures. Some of these early animals developed true tissues, layers of cells specialized for particular functions and working together in coordinated ways. The development of tissues represented a significant advance in complexity, allowing for more sophisticated body structures and more elaborate ways of interacting with the environment. Among the earliest animals with true tissues were the cnidarians, a group that includes modern jellyfish, sea anemones, and corals. And these animals possess a relatively simple body plan, with a hollow central cavity serving as a digestive chamber and a single opening, that functions as both mouth and anus. Their bodies are organized into two distinct tissue layers, an outer layer and an inner layer, with a gelatinous substance between them providing structure and support. This body plan is radially symmetrical, meaning the animal can be divided into similar halves along multiple planes passing through its central axis, much like a cylinder or a wheel. Cnidarians possess specialized cells called cnidocytes, which contain structures called nematocysts. These are tiny, harpoon-like structures that can be discharged with remarkable speed and force to capture prey or deter predators. When triggered by chemical or mechanical stimuli, the nematocyst explodes outward, injecting venom or entangling whatever touched it. This innovation, this particular cellular specialization, has served cnidarians well for more than 550 million years, and remains a defining characteristic of the group today. The early cnidarians lived attached to the seafloor or drifted with ocean currents, just as many of their descendants do today. They captured small prey using their tentacles and their stinging cells, digested food within their central cavity, and reproduced both sexually and asexually, sometimes alternating between different body forms during their life cycle. Some cnidarians formed colonies, with many individuals connected together, sharing resources and working collectively to survive. But these colonial forms would eventually give rise to the great coral reefs that would become some of the most diverse ecosystems in the oceans. As these early animals were evolving and diversifying, the Earth itself was changing. The chemistry of the oceans was shifting gradually, with oxygen levels rising slowly as a result of photosynthetic organisms releasing oxygen as a waste product. This increasing oxygen concentration in the water and atmosphere would eventually enable the evolution of larger, more active animals with higher metabolic rates, but this process unfolded slowly across tens of millions of years. The period between about 630 million years ago and 540 million years ago is sometimes called the Ediacaran period, named after the Ediacara Hills in Australia, where fossils from this time were first discovered in detail. During the Ediacaran period, soft-bodied animals of various forms lived on and in the seafloor. Many of these creatures are difficult to interpret, their body plans unlike anything alive today, their relationships to modern animals uncertain and debated by paleontologists. Some Ediacaran organisms appear to have been frond-like structures, possibly anchored to the seafloor and extending upward into the water, perhaps filtering food from currents or absorbing nutrients through their surfaces. Others seem to have been flat, quilted structures lying on the seafloor, their method of feeding and their precise biology remaining mysterious. Still others may have been mobile, crawling across the seafloor sediments, leaving trace fossils in the form of tracks and burrows that preserve the evidence of their movements long after the animals themselves have vanished. These Ediacaran organisms lived in a world that was, in many ways, quiet and gentle compared to what would come later. There is little evidence of predation during the Ediacaran period, little sign that animals were hunting and eating each other in the way that would become common later in Earth's history. Instead, the Ediacaran organisms appear to have lived peacefully alongside one another, each pursuing its own method of obtaining energy from the environment, whether through filtering, absorbing nutrients, or perhaps even harboring symbiotic photosynthetic organisms within their tissues. This relatively peaceful existence would not last forever. As the Ediacaran period came to a close and the Cambrian period began, roughly 540 million years ago, animal life underwent a dramatic transformation, a period of rapid diversification that paleontologists call the Cambrian explosion. During this time, which lasted perhaps 20 to 25 million years, most of the major groups of animals that exist today first appeared in the fossil record, along with many other groups that would eventually go extinct without leaving any living descendants. The Cambrian explosion was not an explosion in any literal sense. It was not a sudden, instantaneous event, but rather a period of relatively rapid evolutionary innovation spread across millions of years. This might seem like a very long time by human standards, but in geological terms, topped in the context of Earth's 4.5 billion year history, it represents a brief interval during which animal diversity increased dramatically. Several factors may have contributed to this burst of evolutionary innovation. The rising oxygen levels in the oceans and atmosphere would have made it possible for animals to grow larger and to support more active metabolisms. The evolution of predation, the development of animals that hunted and consumed other animals, would have created new selective pressures, driving the evolution of defensive structures like shells and spines, as well as more sophisticated sensory systems and more effective means of locomotion for both predators and prey. The development of hard parts, structures like shells and exoskeletons made of calcium carbonate or other minerals, was particularly important during the Cambrian explosion. These hard parts served protective functions, defending animals against predators and providing structural support for larger bodies. They also preserved much more readily than soft tissues, leaving us with a much richer fossil record from the Cambrian period than from earlier times, allowing us to study these ancient animals in greater detail. Among the most successful and diverse groups of animals to appear during the Cambrian explosion were the arthropods, a group characterized by jointed appendages and a hard external skeleton. The arthropods include insects, spiders, crustaceans, and many extinct groups, representing one of the most successful body plans in the history of animal life. During the Cambrian period, the most prominent arthropods were the trilobites, the animals with segmented bodies divided into 3 lobes running from head to tail, with numerous jointed legs underneath their bodies. Trilobites were remarkably diverse, with thousands of species evolving over the course of their nearly 300 million year history. They ranged in size from less than a millimeter to more than half a meter in length, and they occupied many different ecological roles. Some trilobites crawled along the seafloor, scavenging for food or hunting smaller prey. Others burrowed into sediment, extracting nutrients from the mud. Still others may have been filter feeders, straining particles from the water. Many trilobites possessed complex compound eyes, some of the most sophisticated eyes known from the fossil record, with numerous individual lenses allowing them to detect movement and light from many directions simultaneously. The evolution of complex eyes during the Cambrian period represents another significant innovation. Eyes allow animals to detect light and, in more sophisticated forms, to form images of their surroundings. This capability provides enormous advantages for finding food, avoiding predators, and navigating through the environment. Different groups of animals evolved eyes independently multiple times throughout the history of life, but the Cambrian period saw a particular proliferation of eye designs, from the simple light-sensitive spots of some worms to the complex compound eyes of arthropods and the camera-like eyes of some other groups. Another important group that emerged during the Cambrian explosion was the mollusks, a diverse assemblage of animals that includes snails, clams, squids, and octopuses. Early mollusks were probably small, soft-bodied creatures with simple shells, crawling along the seafloor and feeding on algae or detritus. Over time, mollusks would evolve in remarkable variety of forms and lifestyles, from the sessile clams filtering food from the water to the highly intelligent and active cephalopods, hunting prey with sophisticated behavior and advanced nervous systems. The basic mollusk body plan includes a muscular foot used for locomotion, a visceral mass containing the internal organs, and a mantle, a tissue layer that secretes the shell in those species that possess shells. This flexible body plan has proven highly adaptable, allowing mollusks to colonize nearly every aquatic environment and even, in the case of land snails and slugs, to make the transition from water to land many millions of years later. Echinoderms, the group that includes starfish, sea urchins, and sea cucumbers, also appeared during the Cambrian period. These animals possess a unique five-fold radial symmetry as adults, though their larvae are bilaterally symmetrical, suggesting that echinoderms evolved from bilaterally symmetrical ancestors. Echinoderms possess a water vascular system, a network of fluid-filled canals that operates tube feet used for locomotion, feeding, and respiration. This unusual system is unique to echinoderms and represents yet another example of the many different solutions that evolution has found to the basic problems of animal life. While these invertebrate groups were diversifying and spreading through the oceans, another lineage was emerging that would eventually give rise to all vertebrate animals, including fishes, amphibians, reptiles, birds, and mammals. The earliest members of this lineage, the chordates, were small, soft-bodied animals that possessed several key features: a notochord, a flexible rod running along the length of the body providing support, a dorsal nerve cord running above the notochord, pharyngeal slits, openings in the throat region used for filtering food from water, and a post-anal tail extending beyond the digestive opening. These features are not particularly impressive in themselves, and the earliest chordates were not dominant or even particularly conspicuous members of Cambrian communities. But this basic body plan would prove remarkably successful over the long term, eventually giving rise to the vertebrates, animals in which the notochord is replaced during development by a backbone made of repeating vertebrae. One of the most famous Cambrian animals, known from exceptionally well-preserved fossils found in the Burgess Shale of Canada and similar deposits elsewhere, is Pikaia, a small, swimming creature that appears to have been an early chordate. Pikaia was only a few centimeters long, with a streamlined body and what appears to have been a notochord running along its length. It probably swam through the water by undulating its body from side to side, much like modern lancelets, small, filter-feeding chordates that still exist today, and provide us with a glimpse of what these early chordates might have been like. The Burgess Shale and similar fossil deposits have provided paleontologists with extraordinary windows into Cambrian life because they preserve soft-bodied organisms that would normally leave no fossil trace. In these deposits, we find not only the hard shells and skeletons that commonly fossilize, but also impressions of muscles, guts, gills, and other soft tissues, allowing us to reconstruct these ancient animals in remarkable detail. Among the strange and wonderful creatures preserved in the Burgess Shale is Anomalocaris, one of the largest predators of the Cambrian seas. Anomalocaris could grow to more than half a meter in length, enormous by Cambrian standards, and it possessed large, grasping appendages at the front of its body for capturing prey, compound eyes on stalks, and a mouth with a ring of plates for processing food. Anomalocaris was an arthropod relative, representing an early branch in the arthropod family tree, and it occupied the role of apex predator in its ecosystem, hunting trilobites and other animals. The presence of predators like Anomalocaris in Cambrian seas had profound effects on the evolution of other animals. Prey species evolved various defenses: thicker shells, protective spines, the ability to burrow into sediment, or greater mobility to escape from danger. This arms race between predators and prey, this constant evolutionary pressure from organisms trying to eat each other and organisms trying to avoid being eaten, has been a major driver of animal evolution throughout the history of life and continues to shape animal diversity today. As the Cambrian period progressed and gave way to the Ordovician period around 485 million years ago, animal life continued to diversify and spread. The trilobites remained abundant and diverse, but they were joined by increasing numbers of other arthropods, mollusks, and echinoderms. The first true fishes, animals with bone and more complex body structures than the simple chordates of the Cambrian, began to appear in the fossil record. These early fishes were quite different from the fishes we know today. They lacked jaws, instead possessing a round, sucking mouth similar to that of modern lampreys and hagfishes. They were covered in bony armor, heavy plates that protected them from predators, but also made them rather slow and inflexible swimmers. These armored, jawless fishes were not particularly large, most measuring only a few centimeters to perhaps 30 centimeters in length, and they probably lived on or near the seafloor, feeding on small invertebrates, detritus, or by filtering small particles from the water or sediment. The development of bone was a significant innovation for these early fishes. Bone provided structural support, protected delicate internal organs, and served as a reservoir for calcium and phosphorus, essential minerals that could be mobilized when needed. The earliest bone appeared in the form of small scales and plates in the skin, only later developing into internal skeletons with vertebrae, ribs, and skulls. During the Ordovician period, which lasted from about 485 million years ago to about 443 million years ago, life in the oceans became increasingly complex and diverse. Coral reefs built by various organisms, including corals, sponges, and algae, became more extensive, providing habitat for countless other species. The first forests of seaweed appeared, creating vertical structure in shallow waters and offering shelter and food for many animals. The ocean floor became more heavily burrowed as various worms, arthropods, and other animals excavated tunnels and chambers, mixing the sediment and affecting the flow of nutrients through these ecosystems. The Ordovician period ended with one of the major mass extinctions in Earth's history, probably caused by a period of glaciation, a time when ice sheets expanded dramatically, locking up water and causing sea levels to drop. This extinction event eliminated many species, particularly those adapted to warm, shallow seas, but it did not end the diversification of animal life. Life recovered and continued to evolve, as it had done after earlier setbacks, and as it would do after future mass extinctions. The Silurian period, following the Ordovician, lasted from about 443 million years ago to about 419 million years ago. During this time, coral reefs recovered and expanded, and the first jawed fishes appeared in the fossil record. The evolution of jaws was one of the most significant innovations in vertebrate history, opening up new ways of feeding and new ecological opportunities. Jaws evolved from the gill arches, the bony or cartilaginous structures that support the gills in fishes. The front pair of gill arches became modified, with the upper portion forming the upper jaw and the lower portion forming the lower jaw, while the second pair of gill arches became further modified to support the jaw structure. This transformation did not happen suddenly, but gradually, through many intermediate stages, and it required coordinated changes in muscles, nerves, and bones. With jaws, fishes could bite and grasp prey much more effectively than their jawless ancestors. They could feed on larger and more diverse prey items, and they could process their food more efficiently. Jawed fishes quickly diversified into many different forms, adapted for different diets and different ways of life. Some became active predators, hunting other fishes and invertebrates. Others became specialized for crushing hard-shelled prey like mollusks and echinoderms. Still others retained a diet similar to their jawless ancestors, feeding on small invertebrates and organic debris. The earliest jawed fishes belonged to a group called the placoderms, armored fishes with bony plates covering their heads and the front portions of their bodies. Placoderms were diverse and successful during the Devonian period, which followed the Silurian and lasted from about 419 million years ago to about 359 million years ago. Some placoderms remained small, only a few centimeters long, while others grew to enormous sizes. Dunkleosteus, one of the largest placoderms, could reach lengths of more than 6 meters and possessed massive jaw plates instead of teeth, capable of exerting tremendous bite forces to crush and shear prey. The Devonian period is sometimes called the Age of Fishes because of the remarkable diversity of fishes that lived during this time. In addition to the placoderms, several other groups of fishes were evolving and diversifying. The cartilaginous fishes, ancestors of modern sharks and rays, appeared during the Devonian period. Unlike the heavily armored placoderms, cartilaginous fishes had lighter, more flexible skeletons made of cartilage rather than bone, allowing for more efficient swimming and greater maneuverability. Early sharks were quite different from modern sharks in many ways, but they already possessed some of the key features that would make sharks successful predators: streamlined bodies, powerful tails for propulsion, multiple rows of replaceable teeth, and keen senses for detecting prey. Over the hundreds of millions of years since the Devonian period, sharks have continued to evolve and adapt, surviving multiple mass extinctions and persisting as successful predators in ocean ecosystems all around the world. The bony fishes, which would eventually become the most diverse group of vertebrates, also appeared during the Devonian period. These fishes possessed skeletons made of true bone rather than cartilage, and they developed a swim bladder, a gas-filled organ that allowed them to control their buoyancy and maintain position in the water column without constantly swimming. This innovation made bony fishes more energy efficient than cartilaginous fishes, which must keep swimming to avoid sinking. And it allowed bony fishes to exploit a wider range of depths and habitats. The bony fishes split into two major lineages early in their history. The ray-finned fishes, characterized by fins supported by thin, bony rays, would eventually become by far the most diverse group, including the vast majority of fish species alive today, from minnows to tunas to seahorses. The lobe-finned fishes, characterized by fleshy, muscular fins supported by robust bones, were also diverse during the Devonian period, but most lineages eventually went extinct. However, one lineage of lobe-finned fishes would give rise to the first tetrapods, the first four-legged vertebrates, and eventually to all land vertebrates including amphibians, reptiles, birds, and mammals. During the Devonian period, some lobe-finned fishes lived in shallow freshwater environments, in rivers and lakes and swamps that periodically dried out or became oxygen poor. These challenging conditions favored fishes that could breathe air, at least partially, supplementing the oxygen they obtained through their gills. Several groups of fishes evolved the ability to breathe air using modified swim bladders as primitive lungs, gulping air at the surface and extracting oxygen from it. Some of these air-breathing fishes also possessed strong, muscular fins that could support their weight and allow them to move across mud flats or between pools when water levels dropped. These robust fins were adaptations for life in shallow, vegetation-choked waters, not initially for life on land, but they pre-adapted these fishes for the eventual transition to terrestrial life. Around 375 million years ago, some lobe-finned fishes began making brief excursions onto land. These were not permanent moves, but temporary forays, perhaps to escape predators, to reach new pools of water, or to exploit food resources like insects and other invertebrates that were already living on land. Over many generations, over millions of years, natural selection favored individuals that were better able to move on land, to breathe air more efficiently, and to cope with the challenges of terrestrial life. The transition from water to land required many anatomical changes. Fins needed to become stronger and more leg-like, capable of bearing the body's weight against gravity without the support of water. The skull needed to modify to support the weight of the head without the buoyancy of water. The spine needed to become more robust to prevent the body from sagging. The skin needed to become more resistant to desiccation to prevent the body from drying out in air. The method of reproduction needed to change, as eggs could not simply be released into water to be fertilized externally, but required protection from drying out. These changes did not all happen at once. The transition from water to land was gradual, occurring over perhaps 20 to 30 million years, with many intermediate forms that were neither fully aquatic nor fully terrestrial, but somewhere in between. These intermediate animals, sometimes called fishopods, possessed features of both fishes and tetrapods, with fins that had evolved into limb-like structures but still retained fin rays, with gills and lungs both present, with bodies adapted for swimming but also capable of limited movement on land. One of the most famous of these transitional forms is Tiktaalik, discovered in Arctic Canada in sediments dating to about 375 million years ago. Tiktaalik was about 3 meters long, with a flattened body, a mobile neck unusual in fishes, and robust front fins with wrist-like joints and digit-like bones. Tiktaalik likely lived in shallow streams and ponds, spending time both in water and in very shallow water or mud, using its strong fins to prop itself up and to move across the bottom. By about 365 million years ago, true tetrapods had appeared, animals with 4 distinct limbs bearing digits, though these early tetrapods were still primarily aquatic. Ichthyostega and Acanthostega, 2 early tetrapods from this time, possessed legs with toes, but also retained features like internal gills and fish-like tail fins, suggesting they spent most of their time in water. These early tetrapods had more toes than the 5 that would become standard in later tetrapods, with Acanthostega possessing 8 toes on each front limb and Ichthyostega having 7 toes on its hind limbs. The early tetrapods lived in a world that was beginning to change dramatically. During the Devonian period, plants had begun to colonize the land, starting with small, simple plants close to water, but gradually evolving into larger and more complex forms. By the late Devonian period, forests of tree-like plants were growing in lowland areas, creating shaded, humid environments quite different from the barren landscapes that had existed earlier. These forests provided new habitats and new food sources for animals. Invertebrates, particularly arthropods like insects, and myriapods and arachnids, had colonized land before the vertebrates, and they were diversifying into many different forms, feeding on plants, on detritus, and on each other. These land-dwelling invertebrates represented potential prey for any vertebrate that could exploit them, creating opportunities for tetrapods to expand beyond the water's edge. The Devonian period ended with another mass extinction event around 359 million years ago. The causes of this extinction are still debated, but climate change and ocean anoxia, a lack of oxygen in the water, probably played significant roles. Many marine species went extinct, particularly those living in warm, shallow seas. The placoderms, Nana, which had been so diverse and successful, disappeared completely, leaving no descendants. Other groups survived, but were diminished in diversity. The Carboniferous period, which followed the Devonian and lasted from about 359 million years ago to about 299 million years ago, saw the continued evolution and diversification of tetrapods. During the early Carboniferous, tetrapods began to spend more time on land, developing limbs and bodies better suited for terrestrial locomotion. The skin became thicker and more resistant to water loss, with some groups developing scales for additional protection. The Carboniferous period was a time of vast swamp forests in tropical regions, with enormous trees related to modern club mosses and horsetails growing to heights of 30 or 40 meters. These forests were humid and warm, with dense vegetation and abundant water, creating ideal conditions for amphibious tetrapods that still needed to keep their skin moist and return to water to reproduce. Early tetrapods of the Carboniferous period were diverse in size and form. Some remained aquatic or semi-aquatic throughout their lives, while others became increasingly terrestrial, venturing far from water and spending most of their time on land. These early tetrapods are sometimes referred to as amphibians, though they were quite different from modern amphibians like frogs and salamanders, and not all of them were ancestors of modern amphibians. Many Carboniferous tetrapods were larger than modern amphibians, with some reaching 2 or 3 meters in length. They had heavy skulls, stocky bodies, and short limbs sprawled out to the sides rather than positioned underneath the body. This sprawling posture limited their speed and endurance compared to later animals, but was adequate for their lifestyles, which probably involved spending time in water, basking in sun, and hunting slow-moving prey on land. The most significant development during the Carboniferous period, in terms of long-term evolutionary consequences, was the evolution of the amniotic egg. This was a type of egg that could be laid on land and still protect the developing embryo from desiccation, from drying out. The amniotic egg contains several membranes that serve different functions. The amnion surrounds the embryo in a fluid-filled sac, providing an aquatic environment even on dry land. The allantois stores waste products. The chorion regulates gas exchange. And the yolk sac provides nutrients. The whole structure is typically enclosed in a protective shell, leathery or hard depending on the group. The evolution of the amniotic egg freed vertebrates from the necessity of returning to water to reproduce. Animals with amniotic eggs could lay their eggs in relatively dry environments, could expand into areas far from standing water, and could exploit new habitats and resources unavailable to animals still dependent on aquatic reproduction. This innovation was so significant that all reptiles, birds, and mammals, collectively called amniotes, trace their ancestry back to the first tetrapods that evolved this type of egg during the Carboniferous period. The earliest amniotes were small, lizard-like animals that probably fed on insects and other invertebrates. They were not dramatically different in appearance from their non-amniote contemporaries, but the amniotic egg gave them an advantage in colonizing drier habitats and in reducing predation on their eggs and young, which no longer needed to develop in water where aquatic predators were abundant. Soon after the amniotic egg evolved, the amniots split into 2 major lineages, distinguished by differences in skull structure. The synapsids, characterized by a single opening in the skull behind the eye socket, would eventually give rise to mammals. The sauropsids, characterized by different skull openings or by the absence of such openings in early forms, would eventually give rise to all modern reptiles and birds. During the late Carboniferous and the succeeding Permian period, which lasted from about 299 million years ago to about 252 million years ago, both synapsids and sauropsids diversified considerably. The synapsids, particularly a group called the pelycosaurs, became quite diverse and included the famous sailback Dimetrodon, often mistaken for a dinosaur but actually more closely related to mammals than to any reptile. Dimetrodon was a predator, one of the top carnivores of its time with powerful jaws and sharp teeth. The large sail on its back, supported by elongated vertebral spines, may have served a thermoregulatory function, helping the animal warm up quickly in the morning sun or cool down when necessary by increasing surface area for heat exchange. Dimetrodon and its relatives were ectothermic. meaning they relied on external heat sources to regulate body temperature, as most reptiles do today, though the synapside lineage would eventually evolve endothermy, the ability to generate heat metabolically. The Permian period saw the continued development of terrestrial ecosystems with plants, invertebrates, and vertebrates, all diversifying and adapting to life on land. Seed plants, including early conifers and their relatives, became increasingly important, better adapted to drier conditions than the spore-bearing plants that had dominated Carboniferous forests. Insects continued to diversify, with many groups evolving that would persist to the present day, including the ancestors of beetles, flies, and various other orders. As the Permian period progressed, a group of synapsids, called therapsids, began to replace the pelycosaurs as the dominant large land animals. The therapsids showed several advances over earlier synapsids, including more upright limb posture, more sophisticated jaw mechanics, and possibly the beginnings of endothermy, though this latter point is debated. Some therapsids were large carnivores, others were large herbivores, and still others were small insectivores or omnivores, filling many of the ecological roles that mammals would later occupy. The therapsids included a group called the cynodonts, relatively small, possibly fur-covered animals with many mammal-like features. The cynodonts had differentiated teeth, with incisors for biting, canines for piercing, and molars for chewing, unlike most reptiles, which have relatively uniform teeth. They had a secondary palate, a shelf of bone separating the mouth from the nasal passages, allowing them to breathe while eating. They probably had whiskers, sensitive hairs around the snout used for sensing the environment. Many features suggest that cynodonts were at least partially endothermic and may have been covered in fur for insulation. The Permian period ended with the most severe mass extinction event in Earth's history, sometimes called the Great Dying. Around 252 million years ago, a series of massive volcanic eruptions in what is now Siberia released enormous quantities of lava and volcanic gases, triggering rapid climate change, ocean acidification, and widespread anoxia. The extinctions occurred in multiple pulses over several 100,000 years, and when they were over, more than 90% of marine species and about 70% of terrestrial vertebrate species had gone extinct. The Permian-Triassic extinction decimated the therapsids, eliminating most lineages, though the cynodonts managed to survive in reduced numbers. It also devastated marine ecosystems, eliminating many groups that had been dominant for hundreds of millions of years. The recovery from this extinction was slow, taking millions of years for ecosystems to rebuild and for biodiversity to begin to approach previous levels. The Triassic period, beginning after the Permian-Triassic extinction and lasting from about 252 million years ago to about 201 million years ago, was a time of recovery and reorganization. New groups of animals evolved to fill the ecological roles left vacant by extinction, and the world began to take on a somewhat more modern appearance, though it would still be strange and unfamiliar in many ways. In the aftermath of the Great Extinction at the end of the Permian period, the Earth slowly recovered. The Triassic period marked a new beginning for animal life, though the recovery was gradual, unfolding over millions of years as ecosystems rebuilt themselves and new groups of organisms evolved to fill vacant ecological roles. The climate during the early Triassic was generally warm and dry, with less temperature variation between the poles and the equator than we see today, and much of the interior of the supercontinent Pangaea, which had formed during the late Paleozoic era, was arid desert. The therapsids, though greatly reduced in diversity by the extinction, persisted into the Triassic period. Among them were the cynodonts, those relatively small, mammal-like animals that had survived the end Permian catastrophe. During the Triassic period, the cynodonts continued to evolve more mammalian characteristics. Their teeth became more differentiated, their jaws more specialized for efficient chewing, their limbs more upright in posture. Some cynodonts may have developed lactation, the production of milk to feed their young, though this cannot be confirmed directly from fossils and must be inferred from other anatomical features and from comparisons with modern mammals. By the late Triassic period, around 220 million years ago, the first true mammals appeared. These were very small animals, most no larger than mice or rats, with fully differentiated teeth, highly developed hearing, and almost certainly fur and endothermy. The boundary between advanced cynodonts and early mammals is somewhat arbitrary, defined by particular skeletal features, especially details of the jaw and ear bones. In advanced cynodonts and early mammals, the bones that form the jaw joint in reptiles had begun to migrate backward and become incorporated into the middle ear, eventually forming the tiny bones that transmit sound vibrations in mammalian ears. These early mammals lived in a world dominated not by mammalian relatives, but by a group of sauropsids called archosaurs. The archosaurs, which include the ancestors of modern crocodiles and birds, underwent a dramatic diversification during the Triassic period. They evolved a variety of forms adapted for different lifestyles. Some were quadrupedal and heavily built, others were bipedal and lightly built, some were carnivorous, others were herbivorous. Among the most significant archosaur groups were the dinosaurs, which appeared during the Middle Triassic period around 230 million years ago. The earliest dinosaurs were relatively small, bipedal carnivores, probably no more than a meter or two in length. They were not immediately dominant, but were simply one group among many in Triassic ecosystems. Other archosaurs were more abundant and diverse during most of the Triassic period, including various crocodile relatives that occupied many of the top predator roles. The dinosaurs were distinguished from other archosaurs by several skeletal features, particularly the structure of the hip and the configuration of the ankle, which allowed for more efficient bipedal locomotion. Early dinosaurs had upright limb posture, neck with legs positioned directly underneath the body rather than sprawled out to the sides, and they appear to have been active, possibly endothermic animals, though this latter point remains debated among paleontologists. During the late Triassic period, the dinosaurs began to diversify into the major lineages that would persist through the Mesozoic era. The Saurischia, or lizard-hipped dinosaurs, split into the theropods, bipedal carnivores that would eventually include the famous Tyrannosaurus and Velociraptor, and the sauropodomorphs, which would give rise to the giant long-necked herbivorous dinosaurs. The Ornithischian, or bird-hipped dinosaurs, also appeared during the late Triassic, though they would not become diverse until the Jurassic period. Despite their name, the bird-hipped dinosaurs are not the ancestors of birds. Birds evolved from theropod dinosaurs, which are lizard-hipped. The Triassic period ended with another mass extinction event around 201 million years ago, probably triggered by massive volcanic eruptions associated with the breakup of Pangaea. This extinction eliminated many groups of archosaurs, including most of the non-dinosaurian archosaurs that had been dominant during the Triassic period. The dinosaurs, however, survived, and in the aftermath of the extinction, they diversified rapidly and became the dominant large land animals for the next 135 million years. The Jurassic period, lasting from about 201 million years ago to about 145 million years ago, is often considered the age of dinosaurs. Then, though dinosaurs were actually dominant throughout the entire Mesozoic era, which also includes the Triassic and Cretaceous periods. During the Jurassic period, the dinosaurs reached enormous sizes, particularly among the sauropods, the long-necked herbivores that represent some of the largest land animals ever to exist. Sauropods like Brachiosaurus, Apatosaurus, and Diplodocus could reach lengths of 20 to 30 meters and weights of 30 to 80 metric tons. These enormous animals had tiny heads relative to their body size, long necks for reaching vegetation, massive pillar-like legs to support their weight, and long tails that may have been used for balance, defense, or communication. They were quadrupedal, walking on all fours. And they possessed specialized vertebrae with air-filled spaces that reduced the weight of their enormous skeletons while maintaining strength. The sauropods were herbivores, feeding on the vegetation of Jurassic forests and plains. They did not chew their food extensively, but rather cropped vegetation with their teeth and swallowed it whole or in large pieces, processing it in their digestive systems with the aid of gastroliths, stones deliberately swallowed to help grind up plant material in the stomach. The sauropods needed to consume enormous quantities of vegetation each day to fuel their massive bodies, and their herds would have had significant impacts on the vegetation of their environments, much as large herbivorous mammals like elephants do today. The theropod dinosaurs, the carnivorous dinosaurs, each also diversified during the Jurassic period. Some remained relatively small, probably feeding on insects, small vertebrates, and other small prey. Others grew to impressive sizes and hunted the large herbivorous dinosaurs. Allosaurus, one of the top predators of the late Jurassic period in North America, could reach lengths of 9 or 10 meters and weights of 2 tons or more. It had powerful jaws with sharp serrated teeth designed for slicing through flesh, strong forelimbs with sharp claws for grasping prey, and long, powerful hind limbs for running. The ornithischian dinosaurs also diversified during the Jurassic period. The stegosaurs, characterized by the distinctive plates along their backs and spikes on their tails, were relatively common during the late Jurassic. The function of the plates remains debated. They may have served thermoregulatory functions, display purposes, or defensive roles, or perhaps some combination of these. The tail spikes, called thagomizers, were almost certainly defensive weapons capable of inflicting serious injury on predators. While the dinosaurs dominated the land, other reptiles had returned to the oceans. The ichthyosaurs, which had first appeared in the early Triassic period, were dolphin-like marine reptiles with streamlined bodies, large eyes, and paddle-like limbs. They were fast swimmers, probably feeding on fish and squid, giving birth to live young in the water rather than returning to land to lay eggs. The plesiosaurs, another group of marine reptiles, appeared during the early Jurassic period and diversified into 2 main forms: those with long necks and relatively small heads, now probably feeding on fish captured by rapid strikes of the neck, and those with shorter necks and enormous heads with powerful jaws, probably hunting larger prey, including other marine reptiles. The pterosaurs, flying reptiles that were neither dinosaurs nor birds, also flourished during the Jurassic period. Pterosaurs had appeared during the late Triassic period, and by the Jurassic period they had diversified into many forms, ranging from small insect eaters with wingspans of less than a meter to larger species with wingspans of several meters. Pterosaurs had wings formed by a membrane of skin and muscle, stretching from an enormously elongated 4th finger to the body and hind limbs. They were probably covered in a fur-like integument for insulation, suggesting endothermy, and they had hollow bones to reduce weight for flight. During the Jurassic period, one particular lineage of small theropod dinosaurs was evolving features that would eventually lead to the evolution of birds. These dinosaurs, called Maniraptorans, possessed long arms, elongated fingers, and, in some species, feathers. Feathers initially evolved not for flight but probably for insulation or display, as even non-flying theropods possessed feathers, sometimes quite elaborate ones. Over time, natural selection in certain lineages favored modifications of feathers and forelimbs that provided aerodynamic benefits, perhaps initially for gliding or for generating lift while running. By the late Jurassic period, around 150 million years ago, the first birds had appeared. Archaeopteryx, known from several well-preserved fossils from Germany. D possessed a mosaic of bird-like and dinosaur-like features. It had feathers and wings capable of flight, like modern birds, but it also had teeth, clawed fingers on its wings, and a long, bony tail, like its theropod dinosaur ancestors. Archaeopteryx could probably fly, though perhaps not as efficiently or with as much maneuverability as modern birds, and it may have spent considerable time climbing in trees and gliding between branches. The early mammals, meanwhile, remained small and relatively inconspicuous during the Jurassic period. They diversified into several lineages, occupying various nocturnal niches, probably feeding on insects, small vertebrates, and plant material. Some early mammals were adapted for climbing and probably lived in trees. Others were terrestrial, and still others were semi-aquatic or burrowing. Despite their small size and limited ecological impact during the Mesozoic era, the mammals were evolving important features that would serve them well in the future, including sophisticated teeth for processing different types of food, enhanced senses, particularly hearing and smell, complex behavior, and possibly parental care more intensive than that of most reptiles. The Jurassic period gave way to the Cretaceous period around 145 million years ago. The Cretaceous period was the longest period of the Mesozoic era, lasting from about 145 million years ago to about 66 million years ago. During this time, the world continued to change. The supercontinent Pangaea continued to break apart, with the Atlantic Ocean widening and the continents gradually moving toward their modern positions. The climate remained warm, with sea levels higher than today, and flowering plants, the angiosperms, appeared and diversified, eventually becoming the dominant plants in many terrestrial ecosystems. The flowering plants represented a significant innovation in plant evolution. Unlike earlier plants, which relied on wind or water to distribute pollen, many flowering plants evolved relationships with insects and other animals that carried pollen from flower to flower in exchange for nectar or other rewards. This coevolution between flowering plants and pollinators led to an enormous diversification of both groups, with flowers evolving a remarkable variety of colors, shapes, scents, and rewards, and insect evolving specialized mouthparts, behaviors, and sensory capabilities for exploiting different types of flowers. The dinosaurs continued to dominate terrestrial ecosystems throughout the Cretaceous period. The theropods remained diverse, ranging from tiny insect eaters weighing less than a kilogram to enormous predators weighing several tons. Tyrannosaurus rex, which lived near the end of the Cretaceous period in North America, was one of the largest terrestrial carnivores ever to exist, with individuals reaching lengths of 12 meters and weights of perhaps 8 or 9 tons. Tyrannosaurus had massive jaws with teeth the size of bananas, capable of crushing bone, and its bite force was probably the strongest of any land animal. The Ornithischian dinosaurs became increasingly diverse during the Cretaceous period. The hadrosaurs, or duck-billed dinosaurs, were abundant herbivores with sophisticated teeth arranged in dental batteries, allowing them to efficiently process tough plant material. Some hadrosaurs possessed elaborate crests on their heads, hollow structures that may have been used to produce sounds for communication or to enhance their sense of smell. The ceratopsians, horned dinosaurs like Triceratops, appeared and diversified during the Cretaceous period, many species developing impressive arrays of horns and frills that may have been used for defense, display, or combat with rivals. The ankylosaurs, heavily armored dinosaurs with plates and spikes covering their bodies and large clubs on their tails, were also common during the Cretaceous period. These animals were quadrupedal herbivores, relatively low to the ground, with their armor providing protection from predators. The tail clubs of some species could be swung with considerable force, capable of breaking bones or deterring even large theropods from attacking. The sauropods, while less diverse than they had been during the Jurassic period in some regions, persisted throughout the Cretaceous period and in some areas reached even larger sizes than their Jurassic predecessors. Argentinosaurus from South America may have been the largest land animal ever to exist, with estimates of its weight ranging from 60 to 100 metric tons, though reconstructing the exact size of such enormous animals from incomplete fossil remains is challenging and uncertain. The birds continued to diversify during the Cretaceous period, with many lineages evolving from their theropod dinosaur ancestors. Some of these early birds remained toothed, like Archaeopteryx, while others evolved toothless beaks. Some were specialized for life in water, with adaptations for diving and swimming, while others were adapted for life in trees or for terrestrial habitats. By the end of the Cretaceous period, some bird groups had evolved that would survive the coming extinction and give rise to modern birds. The marine reptiles continued to flourish in the oceans. The mosasaurs, which had appeared during the Middle Cretaceous period, were large marine predators related to monitor lizards. They had elongated bodies, paddle-like limbs, and powerful tails for propulsion. Some mosasaurs reached lengths of more than 15 meters and were apex predators in marine ecosystems, feeding on fish, turtles, and smaller marine reptiles. The plesiosaurs and ichthyosaurs also persisted, though the ichthyosaurs went extinct before the end of the Cretaceous period, their extinction possibly related to changes in ocean chemistry or food availability. The pterosaurs reached their greatest sizes during the Cretaceous period. Quetzalcoatlus, from the late Cretaceous of North America, had a wingspan estimated at 10 to 11 meters, making it one of the largest flying animals ever to exist. Despite its enormous size, Quetzalcoatlus probably weighed only around 200 kilograms, its skeleton constructed of thin-walled hollow bones to minimize weight. How such a large animal achieved flight remains a subject of study, but it probably required running starts and perhaps benefited from strong winds or thermals to become airborne. The mammals, though still relatively small and restricted in their ecological roles during the Cretaceous period, continued to evolve and diversify. And during the Cretaceous period, the three major groups of modern mammals arose: the monotremes, which lay eggs and include the modern platypus and echidnas; the marsupials, which give birth to highly undeveloped young that complete their development in a pouch; and the placentals, which nourish their developing young through a placenta before giving birth to relatively well-developed offspring. These three groups had diverged by the early Cretaceous period, though their early members were all quite small, probably nocturnal, and likely similar in many aspects of their biology. The monotremes retained several features considered primitive for mammals, including egg-laying and certain skeletal characteristics. but they also possess fur, lactation, and other typical mammalian features. The marsupials and placentals both give birth to live young, but they differ in the degree of development at birth and in various details of their reproductive biology. At the end of the Cretaceous period, 66 million years ago, a catastrophe occurred that would fundamentally alter the course of animal evolution. An asteroid approximately 10 to 15 kilometers in diameter struck the Earth in what is now the Yucatan Peninsula in Mexico. The impact released energy equivalent to billions of nuclear weapons, creating an enormous crater, more than 150 kilometers in diameter, triggering earthquakes, tsunamis, and global wildfires. Debris thrown into the atmosphere blocked sunlight for months or years, causing temperatures to plummet and photosynthesis to cease or greatly diminish worldwide. The extinction that followed, called the Cretaceous-Paleogene extinction, eliminated approximately 75% of all species on Earth. All non-avian dinosaurs went extinct, along with the pterosaurs, the mosasaurs, the plesiosaurs, many groups of marine invertebrates, and countless other organisms. The extinction was relatively selective, with different groups affected to different degrees. Animals that required large amounts of food, such as large herbivores, and the carnivores that fed on them, were particularly vulnerable. Animals that could survive for extended periods with limited food, such as scavengers, burrowing animals, and aquatic animals that could feed on detritus, had better survival rates. Among the survivors were the birds, specifically certain lineages of birds that had already evolved by the late Cretaceous period. These birds were relatively small, probably omnivorous or generalist in their diets, and capable of surviving the harsh conditions following the impact. From these survivors, all modern birds would eventually descend, diversifying over the subsequent millions of years into the more than 10,000 species alive today. The mammals also survived, though many lineages went extinct. The survivors were generally small, probably omnivorous or insectivorous, and may have benefited from burrowing behaviors or other traits that helped them survive the impact winter. In the aftermath of the extinction, with the dinosaurs gone and many ecological niches vacant, the mammals began to diversify rapidly, evolving into a wide variety of forms adapted for different diets and lifestyles. The Paleogene period, which began after the Cretaceous-Paleogene extinction and lasted from about 66 million years ago to about 23 million years ago, saw the rise of mammals as the dominant large land animals. During the early Paleogene, in the Paleocene epoch, mammals were still relatively small, most weighing less than 10 kilograms, but they were diversifying rapidly into the major lineages that persist today, including the primates, the rodents, the carnivores, the ungulates or hoofed mammals, and many other groups. By the Eocene epoch, which began about 56 million years ago, mammals had evolved a remarkable diversity of forms. Some had become specialized herbivores, with teeth adapted for grinding plant material and digestive systems capable of processing tough vegetation. Others had become carnivores, with sharp teeth and claws for capturing and consuming prey. Still others had evolved as omnivores, eating both plant and animal material. Some mammalian lineages returned to the oceans, evolving into fully aquatic forms. The whales, which evolved from terrestrial hoofed mammals related to hippos, first appeared during the early Eocene period as semi-aquatic animals with legs still capable of supporting their weight on land. Over the next several million years, whales became progressively more adapted for aquatic life, their forelimbs evolving into flippers, their hind limbs disappearing almost entirely, their bodies becoming streamlined and their tails developing into powerful flukes for propulsion. By the late Eocene period, fully aquatic whales with no functional hind limbs were present in the oceans. Now, other mammalian groups that returned to aquatic life include the Sirenians, or sea cows, which evolved from terrestrial herbivores and adapted to feeding on aquatic vegetation, and the pinnipeds, seals, and sea lions, which evolved from bear-like carnivores and hunt fish and other prey in the oceans while still coming ashore to rest and reproduce. Several mammalian lineages evolved the ability to fly, developing wings formed from skin stretched between elongated finger bones, similar to those of pterosaurs but evolved independently. The bats appeared during the early Eocene period and quickly diversified into many species, eventually becoming the second most diverse order of mammals after rodents. Most bats are insectivorous, capturing flying insects in flight using echolocation, but some bats feed on fruit, others on nectar and pollen. And still others on blood, having evolved specialized adaptations for each of these diets. During the Paleogene period, the world's climate gradually cooled from the warm conditions of the early Paleocene and Eocene. Forests became less extensive in some regions, grasslands began to spread, and seasonal temperature variations became more pronounced. These environmental changes drove evolutionary changes in many animal lineages, with herbivorous mammals evolving teeth better suited for eating grass, carnivores evolving adaptations for hunting on open plains, and many groups evolving larger body sizes. The primates, the group to which humans belong, evolved during the Paleocene epoch from small, probably nocturnal, tree-dwelling insectivores. Early primates possessed grasping hands and feet with nails instead of claws, forward-facing eyes providing binocular vision and depth perception, and relatively large brains compared to other mammals of similar size. These features were adaptations for life in trees, where the ability to judge distances accurately and to grasp branches securely was crucial for survival. During the Eocene and Oligocene epochs, primates diversified into many forms, most remaining arboreal and living in tropical forests. Some lineages evolved larger body sizes, some became more specialized for eating fruits or leaves, others remained primarily insectivorous. The lineage leading to modern monkeys, apes, and humans diverged from other primates during the Eocene epoch, and the Old World monkeys and apes diverged from the New World monkeys as the continents separated and primates on different landmasses evolved independently. The Neogene period, lasting from about 23 million years ago to about 2.5 million years ago, continued the trends established during the Paleogene period, with further cooling and drying of the climate and expansion of grasslands in many regions. During the Neogene period, many of the modern families and genera of mammals appeared, and ecosystems began to take on a more modern appearance. The apes, tailless primates including gibbons, orangutans, gorillas, chimpanzees, bonobos, and humans, evolved during the early Neogene period from monkey-like ancestors. Early apes were forest-dwelling, probably moving through trees using a combination of climbing and arm swinging, and feeding primarily on fruits. As forests contracted in some regions and grasslands expanded, some ape lineages became more terrestrial, spending more time on the ground and adapting to more open habitats. The hominins, the lineage including modern humans and our extinct relatives more closely related to us than to chimpanzees, diverged from the chimpanzee lineage around 6 to 7 million years ago. The earliest hominins were probably similar to chimpanzees in many ways, living in forested or woodland habitats and feeding on fruits, leaves, and possibly some animal foods. Over time, some hominin lineages evolved more upright posture and bipedal locomotion, walking on 2 legs rather than 4. Bipedalism evolved gradually over several million years, and the reasons for this transition remain debated among anthropologists. Possible advantages of bipedalism include the ability to see over tall grass, more efficient long-distance walking, freeing the hands for carrying objects or tools, and better thermoregulation in hot, open environments. Whatever the initial advantages, bipedalism became a defining characteristic of the hominin lineage and set the stage for many subsequent evolutionary changes. During the Pliocene epoch, which lasted from about 5 million years ago to about 2.5 million years ago, several genera of hominins existed, many coexisting in time and space in Africa. Australopithecus, one of the best-known early hominin genera, included several species that combined ape-like features such as relatively small brains with human-like features such as bipedal locomotion. Australopithecus afarensis, known from fossils dating to about 3 to 4 million years ago, was a relatively small hominin, standing about 1 to 1.5 meters tall. With arms somewhat longer relative to its legs than in modern humans, suggesting it still spent some time in trees. Other hominin genera from the Pliocene and early Pleistocene epochs include Paranthropus, characterized by massive jaws and teeth adapted for processing tough plant materials, and early members of the genus Homo, our own genus, which appeared around 2.5 million years ago. The earliest Homo species had slightly larger brains than Australopithecus, averaging around 600 to 700 cubic centimeters compared to about 400 to 500 cubic centimeters in Australopithecus. And they appear to have made and used stone tools, marking a significant technological innovation. The Pleistocene epoch began around 2.5 million years ago and lasted until about 11,700 years ago. This was a time of repeated glaciations, periods when ice sheets expanded dramatically from the poles, covering much of northern North America, Europe, and Asia, as well as portions of the southern continents. Between these glacial periods were interglacials, warmer intervals when the ice retreated to roughly its present extent. These cycles of glaciation and warming occurred throughout the Pleistocene epoch, driven by variations in Earth's orbit and axial tilt that affected the amount and distribution of solar energy reaching the planet's surface. The repeated advance and retreat of ice sheets had profound effects on animal life. During glacial periods, habitats shifted toward the equator. Forests contracted, grasslands and tundra expanded, and sea levels dropped as water became locked in ice sheets. During interglacials, the patterns reversed. Many animals migrated in response to these changes, following suitable habitats as they moved north and south or up and down in elevation. Other animals adapted to the cold conditions, evolving features like thick fur, large body size to conserve heat, and behavioral adaptations for surviving long, harsh winters. The genus Homo continued to evolve during the Pleistocene epoch. Several species coexisted at various times and places with different species, sometimes overlapping in range and possibly interacting. Homo erectus appeared around 2 million years ago and was the first hominin species to expand beyond Africa, with fossils found in Asia and possibly Europe. Homo erectus had a larger brain than earlier hominins, averaging around 900 cubic centimeters, and made more sophisticated stone tools, controlled fire, and possibly engaged in cooperative hunting of large game. Other species of Homo evolved in different regions. Homo heidelbergensis, which appeared around 700,000 years ago, was present in Africa, Europe, and Western Asia, and had brain sizes approaching those of modern humans. Homo heidelbergensis may have been the last common ancestor of several later species, including Homo neanderthalensis, the Neanderthals, who evolved in Europe and Western Asia, and Homo sapiens, modern humans, who evolved in Africa. The Neanderthals were robust hominins adapted to cold climates with thick bones, large brains averaging slightly larger than those of modern humans, and distinctive features including prominent brow ridges and large noses. They lived in Europe and Western Asia from about 400,000 years ago until about 40,000 years ago, surviving through multiple glacial cycles. Neanderthals made sophisticated stone tools, controlled fire, built shelters, cared for injured and elderly individuals, and buried their dead, behaviors indicating complex social structures and symbolic thinking. Homo sapiens, anatomically modern humans, evolved in Africa around 300,000 years ago, based on the oldest fossils currently known. Early Homo sapiens had the same basic skeletal structure as modern humans, with high foreheads, reduced brow ridges, and chins, though their behavior and culture continued to evolve over the subsequent hundreds of thousands of years. Toward around 70,000 years ago, some populations of Homo sapiens began to migrate out of Africa, spreading into the Middle East and then into Asia, Europe, and eventually reaching Australia by about 65,000 years ago, and the Americas by at least 15,000 years ago, possibly earlier. As modern humans spread, they encountered other hominin species, including Neanderthals in Europe and Western Asia, and Denisovans, another archaic human group known mainly from genetic evidence and a few fossils from Asia. There's evidence that modern humans interbred with these other hominin species to some degree, as most people of non-African descent carry small amounts of Neanderthal DNA in their genomes, and some Asian and Oceanian populations carry Denisovan DNA. However, Neanderthals, Denisovans, and other archaic human species eventually went extinct, leaving Homo sapiens as the only surviving hominin species. The reasons for the extinction of these other species are debated, with possible factors including competition with modern humans, climate change, disease, and assimilation through interbreeding. During the Pleistocene epoch, many large mammals lived alongside humans and their hominin relatives. These megafauna included mammoths and mastodons, relatives of modern elephants covered in thick fur and adapted to cold climates, giant ground sloths, some as large as modern elephants, saber-toothed cats, predators with enormously elongated canine teeth used for killing large prey, giant short-faced bears, the largest predatory mammals in North America, and many other species. These large animals played important roles in their ecosystems, affecting vegetation through their browsing and grazing, serving as prey for large predators, and creating habitats for other species through their activities. The presence of such large animals influenced the evolution and behavior of many other organisms, including early humans who hunted some megafauna species for food and materials. Toward the end of the Pleistocene epoch, many of these large mammals went extinct, a pattern repeated across most continents, but particularly pronounced in the Americas and Australia. The timing of these extinctions often coincides with the arrival of modern humans in different regions, leading to debates about the relative importance of human hunting versus climate change in driving these extinctions. Most likely, both factors played roles, with human hunting pressure exacerbating the effects of climate change and habitat loss as the world transitioned from glacial to interglacial conditions. The Pleistocene epoch ended about 11,700 years ago, marking the beginning of the Holocene epoch, the current geological epoch in which we still live. The transition from the Pleistocene to the Holocene was marked by the end of the last glacial period, with ice sheets retreating, sea levels rising, and climates warming to roughly their present state. The world's vegetation zones shifted northward in the northern hemisphere and upward in elevation in mountainous regions, with forests expanding in some areas and deserts expanding in others. As the climate stabilized during the early Holocene, then human populations in various parts of the world began to develop agriculture, the deliberate cultivation of plants and domestication of animals for food. This transition, sometimes called the Neolithic Revolution, occurred independently in several regions, including the Middle East, China, Mesoamerica, the Andes, and possibly West Africa and New Guinea. The development of agriculture had profound effects on human societies, allowing for larger, more sedentary populations, leading to the development of villages, towns, and eventually cities, and fundamentally altering human relationships with the natural world. The domestication of animals was part of this agricultural transition. Dogs were probably the first animals to be domesticated, possibly more than 15,000 years ago, evolving from wolves that lived in association with human camps and gradually becoming adapted to life with people. Other animals followed: sheep and goats around 11,000 years ago, cattle around 10,000 years ago, pigs, chickens, horses, and many other species in various regions and at various times. Domestication involves selecting animals for traits useful to humans, such as docility, reduced aggression, smaller body size in some cases, and particular physical features. Over many generations, this artificial selection, similar in principle to natural selection but directed by human choices, resulted in animals that looked and behaved quite differently from their wild ancestors. Modern domestic animals often retain juvenile characteristics throughout their lives, a phenomenon called neoteny. And they typically have smaller brains relative to body size than their wild relatives, possibly because the need for complex behavior and problem solving is reduced in domestic environments. The spread of agriculture and the growth of human populations had increasing impacts on other animal species and on ecosystems more broadly. Forests were cleared for cropland and pasture, wetlands were drained, rivers were dammed and diverted, and wild animals were hunted for food, materials, or to reduce competition with domesticated species. These impacts increased over time, particularly dramatically during the last few centuries, as human populations grew exponentially and technology became more powerful and far-reaching. Many animal species went extinct or saw their ranges and populations reduced dramatically due to human activities. The large mammals were particularly vulnerable, as they typically have slow reproductive rates and require large territories. The passenger pigeon, once among the most abundant birds in North America with populations estimated in the billions, was hunted to extinction, with the last individual dying in captivity in the year 1914. The aurochs, the wild ancestor of domestic cattle, went extinct in Europe in 1627. The thylacine, a carnivorous marsupial from Australia and Tasmania, went extinct in the 1930s. Many other species have suffered similar fates. At the same time, humans have transported species far beyond their natural ranges, intentionally or accidentally, leading to the establishment of non-native species in ecosystems worldwide. Some of these introduced species have become invasive, outcompeting native species, altering habitats, or bringing diseases to which native species have no resistance. Islands have been particularly affected, as their native species often evolved in isolation without predators or competitors and are especially vulnerable when new species arrive. Despite these impacts, animal life has continued to evolve, though the timescales on which we can observe evolutionary changes in most animals are much longer than human lifetimes, or even than recorded human history. Some evolutionary changes, however, occur rapidly enough to be observed directly. Urban environments have created new selective pressures, with some species adapting to life in cities, evolving changes in behavior, diet, and physical characteristics. Pollution has driven evolutionary changes in some species, with classic examples including moths in industrial England that evolved darker coloration to match soot-darkened trees, and fish in polluted waters evolving resistance to toxic chemicals. The increasing human population and the spread of human-modified landscapes have led to habitat fragmentation for many species, with natural habitats broken into smaller and smaller patches separated by cropland, roads, and urban areas. This fragmentation affects animal populations by reducing the amount of suitable habitat, isolating populations from each other, and reducing gene flow, and making it more difficult for animals to find food, mates, and shelter. Many species have declined as a result, and conservation efforts increasingly focus on maintaining or creating habitat connectivity, allowing animals to move between patches of suitable habitat. Climate change, driven by increasing atmospheric concentrations of carbon dioxide and other greenhouse gases from the burning of fossil fuels and deforestation, is altering temperatures, precipitation patterns, and sea levels worldwide. Many animal species are shifting their ranges in response, moving toward the poles or to higher elevations to track suitable climate conditions. Some species are able to make these shifts successfully, while others are constrained by geographic barriers, by the rate of climate change, or by the availability of suitable habitat in new areas. Species adapted to cold climates, mountaintop species, and polar species are particularly vulnerable, as they may have nowhere to go as their current habitats become unsuitable. Ocean ecosystems are affected by climate change through warming water temperatures, ocean acidification caused by absorption of carbon dioxide, and changing ocean currents and chemistry. Coral reefs, among the most diverse marine ecosystems, are particularly vulnerable to warming and acidification, with many reefs experiencing bleaching events in which the symbiotic algae that provide corals with nutrients are expelled, often leading to coral death if stress continues. Many marine species are shifting their distributions in response to changing ocean conditions, with tropical species moving toward the poles and some cold water species running out of suitable habitat. The cumulative impacts of habitat loss, pollution, climate change, overexploitation, and invasive species have led some biologists to suggest we are currently experiencing a sixth mass extinction, comparable in scale to the 5 major extinctions recognized in the geological record, though occurring much more rapidly and driven by the activities of a single species, humans. Current extinction rates appear to be hundreds or thousands of times higher than background extinction rates, the normal pace of extinctions that would occur without human influence, and many species that have not yet gone extinct have suffered dramatic population declines and range contractions. Despite these concerns, there are also reasons for hope. Conservation efforts have successfully protected many species and habitats, have brought some species back from the brink of extinction, and have increased awareness of the value of biodiversity and the need to maintain healthy ecosystems. Protected areas, including national parks, wildlife reserves, and marine protected areas, now cover substantial portions of the Earth's surface, though questions remain about whether these areas are large enough, well enough protected, and well enough connected to ensure the long-term survival of the species they are meant to protect. Captive breeding programs have successfully increased populations of some critically endangered species, with individuals sometimes reintroduced to the wild to establish new populations or supplement existing ones. Legal protections have reduced hunting pressure on many species, and international agreements have restricted trade in endangered species and their products. Restoration efforts have successfully restored degraded habitats in many areas, allowing native species to return and ecosystems to recover. Understanding animal evolution provides context for conservation efforts by revealing the deep history of life on Earth, the relationships among species, and the processes that have shaped biodiversity over billions of years. It reminds us that species are not fixed or unchanging, but are products of long evolutionary histories, connected through common ancestry and continuing to evolve in response to changing environments. It shows us that life is resilient, having survived multiple mass extinctions and having repeatedly diversified to fill vacant niches, but also that extinctions are permanent, that once a species is lost, it cannot be recovered, and that the current pace of extinction is far faster than the pace at which new species typically arise. The story of animal evolution is a story of gradual change, accumulating slowly over immense spans of time, driven by the interplay between random genetic variation and natural selection, shaped by environmental changes, mass extinctions, and the evolution of new innovations. From the first simple multicellular animals in ancient oceans, life has diversified into an extraordinary variety of forms, adapted to nearly every environment on Earth, from the deepest ocean trenches to the highest mountains, from frozen polar regions to scorching deserts, from the open ocean to the depths of soil. Each species alive today represents an unbroken line of descent, stretching back billions of years to the origin of life itself. A lineage that has never gone extinct, that has successfully reproduced in every generation, that has survived countless environmental challenges and changes. Each species is adapted to its particular way of life, through features inherited from ancestors and modified over generations, features that reflect both ancient evolutionary history and more recent adaptations to specific environments. The study of animal evolution continues to reveal new insights about the history of life and the processes that shape biodiversity. New fossils are discovered regularly, filling gaps in our understanding and sometimes challenging previous interpretations. New techniques in molecular biology allow scientists to read genetic information from living species and increasingly from ancient DNA preserved in fossils, then providing independent evidence about evolutionary relationships and the timing of evolutionary events. New methods of analysis allow paleontologists to reconstruct the biology and behavior of extinct animals in increasing detail, revealing how they moved, what they ate, how fast they grew, and in some cases, even what colors they were. Despite more than 2 centuries of intensive study since the theory of evolution was first articulated in detail, many questions remain unanswered. The exact relationships among some groups of organisms remain uncertain, debated among scientists using different data sets and different analytical methods. The relative importance of different evolutionary processes, such as natural selection, genetic drift, and other mechanisms, continues to be investigated and debated. The factors that drive speciation, the process by which new species arise, and the factors that affect rates of evolution remain active areas of research. The fossil record, while remarkably rich in some ways and in some places, remains incomplete, with many gaps representing times and places and groups of organisms for which few or no fossils have been found. Soft-bodied organisms, small organisms, organisms living in environments where preservation is unlikely, and organisms from time periods when conditions were not conducive to fossilization are all underrepresented in the fossil record, making some questions about ancient life difficult or impossible to answer with certainty. Nevertheless, the overall pattern is clear, supported by multiple independent lines of evidence from paleontology, comparative anatomy, embryology, biogeography, and molecular biology. Life on Earth shares common ancestry, with all organisms descended from earlier forms through processes of reproduction, variation, and selection. The diversity of life has increased over time despite periodic setbacks from mass extinctions, with new forms arising through modification of ancestral forms, sometimes slowly and gradually, sometimes more rapidly when new environments or ecological opportunities become available. The timescales involved in evolution are difficult to comprehend intuitively. 1,000,000 years, a span of time vast beyond human experience, is a relatively brief interval in Earth history, barely visible in most geological records. The Cambrian explosion, that burst of animal diversification that seemed rapid by geological standards, lasted 20 to 25 million years, a span thousands of times longer than all of recorded human history. The time from the first dinosaurs to the extinction of non-avian dinosaurs was roughly 165 million years, a period during which the dinosaurs evolved, diversified, dominated terrestrial ecosystems, and then vanished, a span of time 30 times longer than the entire history of mammals as dominant large land animals. These immense timescales allowed for the accumulation of small changes generation by generation, changes that individually might be barely noticeable, but that added together over millions of generations produced profound transformations. A fish evolving into a tetrapod, a reptile evolving into a mammal, a dinosaur evolving into a bird. These transitions did not happen in single dramatic leaps, but through countless intermediate stages, each slightly different from the one before, each successful in its own right, each reproducing and passing on its characteristics to the next generation. The mechanisms of evolution, while understood in general terms, are still being investigated at finer scales. Mutations, random changes in DNA sequences, provide the raw material for evolution, introducing new genetic variation into populations. Most mutations are neutral, having no effect on the organism's fitness, while others are deleterious. Reducing fitness and a small proportion are beneficial, increasing fitness in the particular environment where the organism lives. Natural selection acts on this variation, with individuals carrying beneficial mutations tending to leave more offspring, and thus increasing the frequency of those mutations in the population over time. But evolution is not simply a matter of selection acting on mutations. Other processes also affect evolutionary change. Genetic drift, random fluctuations in gene frequencies due to chance events, can be important, especially in small populations. Gene flow, the movement of genes between populations through migration and interbreeding, can introduce new variation or homogenize populations, preventing them from diverging. Sexual selection, a form of natural selection related to success in obtaining mates rather than survival, can drive the evolution of elaborate traits like the peacock's tail or the antlers of deer. The complexity of development, the process by which a single fertilized egg becomes an adult organism, constrains evolution in some ways while enabling it in others, as changes in developmental genes can sometimes produce large effects on adult form. The history of animal evolution is not a simple progression from simple to complex, from primitive to advanced. Evolution has no direction or goal, no intended endpoint toward which life is progressing. Instead, evolution is a process of adaptation to changing environments, with natural selection favoring whatever characteristics increase reproductive success in particular circumstances. Sometimes this leads to increasing complexity, as when simple colonies of cells evolved into animals with tissues and organs and nervous systems. Sometimes it leads to simplification, as when parasites lose structures and functions unnecessary for their lifestyle, or when animals adapt into cave environments, lose their eyes. Nor is evolution a competitive process with winners and losers in any absolute sense. Success in evolution is measured only by reproductive success, by leaving offspring that themselves survive and reproduce. A species is not superior to others in any objective way. It is simply adapted to its particular way of life in its particular environment. Simple organisms like bacteria and archaea have been extraordinarily successful by this measure, having existed for billions of years and colonized virtually every environment on Earth. Their simplicity is not a mark of inferiority, but an effective adaptation to their microscopic lifestyle. The interrelatedness of all life, revealed through evolutionary studies, carries implications for how we think about ourselves and other species. Humans are not separate from nature but part of it, pure products of the same evolutionary processes that have shaped all other life. The features we possess, from our backbones to our four-chambered hearts, to our grasping hands, to our large brains, are inherited from ancestors we share with other species, modified through our particular evolutionary history. We share more than 98% of our DNA with chimpanzees, our closest living relatives, and substantial amounts of our DNA with all other vertebrates, indeed with all other life. This shared ancestry means that studying other animals can provide insights into human biology. Many biological processes are remarkably conserved across species, operating similarly in humans and in organisms as different as fruit flies or yeast. Medical research often uses animal models to understand human diseases and to develop treatments, relying on the fact that fundamental biological mechanisms are shared across large groups of organisms. Understanding evolution helps explain why these similarities exist and helps guide decisions about which organisms are most appropriate as models for particular aspects of human biology. The evolution of animals has been influenced by and has influenced the evolution of other forms of life. Plants and animals have co-evolved in countless ways, with flowering plants and their pollinators providing a clear example of how different species can shape each other's evolution. The evolution of herbivorous animals influenced plant evolution, driving the development of defensive chemicals, tough tissues, and growth patterns that tolerate grazing. The evolution of predators influenced the evolution of prey and vice versa, is in ongoing evolutionary arms races. Parasites and their hosts co-evolve, with parasites evolving ways to exploit hosts and hosts evolving defenses against parasites. The global ecosystem, the sum total of all organisms and their interactions with each other and with their physical environment, has itself evolved over geological time. The early Earth, before the evolution of photosynthetic organisms, had an atmosphere with little oxygen. The evolution of photosynthesis, first in bacteria and later in plants, gradually increased atmospheric oxygen concentrations, making possible the evolution of more complex, energy-intensive life forms. The evolution of land plants stabilized soils, altered weathering processes, and changed the water cycle. The evolution of various organisms has altered ocean chemistry, atmospheric composition, and climate, which in turn have affected the subsequent evolution of life. We are living in a time of rapid environmental change, with human activities altering ecosystems at rates far faster than the pace at which most species can evolve adaptations. Some species are able to respond evolutionarily to these rapid changes, particularly species with short generation times and large populations, like insects or microorganisms. Pesticide resistance in agricultural pests, antibiotic resistance in bacteria, and resistance to pollution in various organisms all demonstrate that evolution continues in the modern world, responding to the new selective pressures created by human activities. However, most species cannot evolve fast enough to keep pace with the current rate of environmental change. Evolution typically requires many generations to produce significant adaptations, and for long-lived species with slow reproductive rates, this means thousands or millions of years. Species facing rapid habitat loss, climate change, or other human-caused stresses must often adapt through behavioral flexibility, moving to new areas or adjusting their behavior and ecology within the limits of their existing adaptations, rather than through evolutionary change. Looking to the future, animal evolution will continue as long as animals exist, driven by the same basic processes that have operated throughout the history of life. The particular directions evolution takes will depend on environmental conditions on which species survive current challenges and on unpredictable events like mutations and climate changes and geological events. If humans continue to alter the Earth's environment at current rates, the composition of animal life will likely change substantially, with some species going extinct and others expanding, with novel ecosystems emerging in some places and degraded ecosystems persisting in others. The geological record shows that life has survived even the most severe mass extinctions, though recovery took millions of years, and the world that emerged after these extinctions was always different from the world before, with different groups dominating and different ecological patterns prevailing. If humans were to go extinct or to dramatically reduce our impacts on the planet, evolution would continue, with surviving species eventually diversifying to fill vacant ecological roles. Just as mammals diversified after the extinction of non-avian dinosaurs, and as earlier groups diversified after earlier extinctions. The study of animal evolution provides not only knowledge about the history of life, but also perspective on our own place in that history. Humans are very recent arrivals on the evolutionary scene, our species having existed for only about 300,000 years out of the more than 3 billion years that life has existed on Earth. Our recorded history covers only about 5,000 years, a blink of an eye in geological time. Yet in this brief span, we have become perhaps the most influential species on the planet, with impacts on ecosystems and on other species that will persist for millennia or longer. The recognition of our evolutionary connection to all other life, of the deep history we share with every living thing, can inform how we think about our responsibilities toward other species and toward the planet. We are not outside observers of nature, but participants in it, products of evolution who have developed the capacity to understand our own origins and to influence the future course of evolution through our actions. This knowledge carries with it a certain weight, a responsibility to consider the consequences of our choices, not just for ourselves, but for the countless other species with which we share this planet. The story of animal evolution is still being written, not only by the continuing processes of natural selection and genetic drift and all the other mechanisms that have shaped life for billions of years, but also now by human decisions about how we use land and resources, how we respond to climate change, which species we protect and which we allow to disappear. Understanding the deep history of life, the immense timescales over which evolution operates, the fragility of species, and the resilience of life as a whole can inform these decisions and perhaps inspire a sense of wonder at the intricate and beautiful diversity of life that surrounds us. A diversity that is the product of billions of years of evolution and that represents an irreplaceable natural heritage. In the quiet depths of ancient oceans, life began its long journey toward the extraordinary diversity we see today. Through countless generations, through millions of years of slow change and occasional rapid transformations, through mass extinctions and subsequent recoveries, through the evolution of new features and the loss of old ones, through the spread of life from water to land to air, animals have come to occupy nearly every habitat on Earth. Each species is a unique solution to the problem of survival, shaped by its evolutionary history and by the environments its ancestors encountered. Each species is connected through deep time to all others, part of the great tree of life, whose roots extend back to the origin of life itself, and whose branches continue to grow, slowly and steadily, into an uncertain but endlessly fascinating future. The pace of evolution is slow, measured not in human lifetimes but in millions of years, in countless generations of gradual change. Yet this slow pace has produced the entire diversity of animal life, from sponges to insects, to fishes to birds to mammals. From the smallest nematode worms less than a millimeter long to the largest blue whales more than 30 meters in length, from animals living in the coldest polar regions to those thriving in the hottest deserts, from the deepest ocean trenches to the highest mountain peaks. All of this diversity arose through the simple mechanisms of variation, heredity, and selection, operating over vast expanses of time, building complexity slowly, one generation at a time, without plan or purpose, but nevertheless producing patterns of order and adaptation that inspire awe and wonder in those who take the time to study them. This is the story of animal evolution, a story of deep time and slow change, of innovation and extinction, of adaptation and diversification. A story that continues today and will continue as long as animals exist on Earth. It is a story without an ending, a process rather than a progression, an ongoing exploration of the possible ways to be an animal, to live and reproduce and pass on genetic material to future generations. It is a story that reminds us of the antiquity of life, the connections between all living things, and the extraordinary journey that life has taken from simple beginnings in ancient seas to the rich diversity of forms that inhabit our planet today.